In the heart of a nation, power once thrived in the corridors of government. Decisions were made, decrees issued, and the machinery of state pulsed with life. Yet, in the span of a few decades, or even years, this government would not collapse with violence, nor with revolution. It would vanish quietly, silently, almost imperceptibly, leaving behind only echoes of its former authority. This is the story of a state that fell in silence, not with a bang, nor through war, but through a slow unraveling of trust, legitimacy, and governance. A story of ambition and complacency, of public service abandoned, and of institutions that crumbled under their own weight. Across history, governments have fallen for myriad reasons: coups, invasions, civil unrest. But there exists a rarer kind of collapse, one that unfolds quietly, one that leaves no headlines screaming the fall of empires, only subtle shifts and the steady disappearance of authority. The story begins not with failure, but with ambition. Leaders of this government rose with ideals, with a vision of modernity and progress. Institutions were built, not on fragile promises alone, but on a foundation of trust, hierarchy, and tradition. Yet even the strongest foundations carry hidden cracks. Laws were enacted, yet enforcement faltered. Policies were implemented, yet compliance waned. The seeds of silence were sown in the very structures designed to maintain authority. Every empire, every state, carries with it a paradox. The more it centralizes power, the more it risks alienating those it governs. And when the people withdraw their attention, when the bureaucrats adhere only to procedure without conviction, governance begins to erode, not with noise, but in whispers. This government did not fail in battle. It did not succumb to rebellion. Its collapse was procedural, technical, and psychological. It fell into silence because the lifeblood of any state, its legitimacy, was quietly drained. Institutions are the vessels of governance. Yet even the most carefully constructed institutions are vulnerable to the corrosion of neglect and the sediment of indifference. In this state, key agencies began to lose their capacity to act. Departments became echo chambers. Decisions delayed became decisions denied. As accountability eroded, corruption, once sporadic, became systemic. Every unchecked action, every ignored protocol, was a silent coup against the authority of the state itself. Citizens began to notice less, care less, and demand less. And the government, paradoxically, collapsed not through overt attack, but through its own inability to sustain relevance. The erosion was invisible to most. Daily life continued. Commerce persisted. Yet the very spine of governance, the capacity to enforce, to inspire, to act, was crumbling. It is a quiet horror, the slow death of a state, witnessed only by those attuned to the subtle signs, unanswered petitions, delayed policies, invisible budgets. In retrospect, the warning signs were everywhere, yet invisible in the grand narrative. Minor scandals, procedural lapses, and the gradual hollowing of political accountability often pass unnoticed in a busy world. Silence became both symptom and strategy. Leaders, aware of the fissures, spoke with vague reassurances rather than decisive action. Bureaucrats followed rules without spirit. Citizens adapted to inefficiency. The state persisted, yet only in form. It is said that empires die with the clash of armies, yet some die unnoticed, in quiet rooms, through minutes lost in indecision, and authority quietly eroded until no one remembers the last time the government truly served. In the final years, the government existed in a peculiar state of denial. Each crisis was treated as temporary, each protest as isolated, each failure as an exception. Yet exceptions became the norm, and norms became the memory of what once was. Citizens began to govern themselves. Local institutions took over roles once reserved for the state. In its silence, the government was still present, yet absent. A paradox of governance that had failed not with a scream, but with a sigh. To study this collapse is to study silence itself. The lessons are stark. Authority must be earned and maintained, not assumed. Legitimacy is fragile, and trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. Yet, in its silence, the government leaves behind a story of resilience, of citizens who adapted, of institutions that learned from absence. History does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And in that whisper, the collapse speaks louder than any revolution ever could. Long before the silent collapse, the seeds of decay were already sown. Governments, like all human institutions, inherit not only the ambition of their founders, but also their blind spots. In the early decades, this government was marked by optimism, expansion, and the promise of modernity. Grand infrastructure projects, ambitious reforms, and bold declarations of progress projected an image of competence and inevitability. Yet beneath the surface, structural weaknesses accumulated. Decisions were centralized, transparency limited, and dissenting voices marginalized. The very systems designed to protect governance, audits, checks and balances, independent oversight, were slowly hollowed. What began as cautious centralization became suffocating rigidity. Policies were applied unevenly, favors often decided by personal networks rather than institutional logic. And in that imbalance, cracks appeared, quietly widening with every unrecorded failure. These cracks were imperceptible to many at first. Citizens continued to trust, perhaps naively, in the machinery of governance. Yet within the ministries, the whispers began. Departments competed for influence rather than coherence. Officials prioritized survival over service. The culture of administration shifted from responsibility to self-preservation. It was here, in these quiet compromises and incremental failures, that the silent collapse was set in motion. Complacency is rarely dramatic. It seeps in slowly, unnoticed, tolerated as a minor flaw. Yet it is a force as destructive as war. In this government, complacency became systemic. Officials once inspired by ideals began to follow routines mechanically. Performance reports were filed, but seldom reviewed. Policies were implemented, but with minimal engagement. Meetings occurred without decisions. Leadership existed in form, but not in function. And so, while the machinery of governance appeared intact to the casual observer, it was hollow at its core. The government continued to operate in appearance only, a ghost administration presiding over a society that increasingly relied on itself. In this culture, failure was normalized. Transparency eroded, ambition stagnated, and public trust quietly retreated. And as the people disengaged, the state's collapse became inevitable, not violent, not dramatic, but absolute in its silence. It is in the absence of confrontation, in the lack of scrutiny, that governments die most effectively. Complacency, silent yet potent, became the invisible hand that dismantled authority from within. To understand the depth of the collapse, one must examine its most telling failures. In one instance, a nationwide healthcare initiative, once celebrated as revolutionary, fell into bureaucratic limbo. Supplies were delayed, hospitals understaffed, and patients left unattended. Policies existed on paper, but execution was absent. In education, schools opened but lacked teachers, textbooks, or oversight. In agriculture, subsidies were promised but never delivered, leaving farmers reliant on informal networks. Every program, every initiative, once intended to reinforce the state's legitimacy, instead highlighted its growing ineffectiveness. These failures were neither accidental nor immediately catastrophic. They accumulated, quietly, like sand filling the machinery of governance. Each unfulfilled promise, each neglected responsibility, became a testament to the state's diminishing capacity. And with every unheeded failure, citizens' reliance on the government eroded further, replaced by improvisation and local solutions. Such failures, when aggregated, tell a story of a government that no longer governed. It existed, yet it did not serve. It legislated, yet it did not enforce. And in this paradox, the collapse became not just inevitable, but almost imperceptible, silent in its passage, yet absolute in consequence. Montage of governments across history and geography that faced similar quiet collapses. Archival footage of post-colonial administrations, Eastern European states in transition, and contemporary governments struggling with institutional inertia. This is not an isolated story. Around the world, governments have collapsed quietly, not through coups of foreign invasion, but through internal decay. In Eastern Europe, post-industrial administrations struggled with bureaucratic inertia. In post-colonial states, the weight of inherited institutions became impossible to bear. The lessons are universal. No state survives purely on authority claimed. It survives on authority recognized. No government can endure if its institutions fail to act, its leaders fail to inspire, and its citizens fail to believe. The silent collapse is perhaps the most insidious form of failure because it leaves few dramatic markers. Wars, coups, revolutions, they are witnessed. Silent collapses are lived, slowly, over decades, by those who adapt and endure. The collapse of a government is often measured in institutions and policies, yet its deepest impact is human. The silent dismantling of authority reshapes lives in ways that are both subtle and profound. Citizens adapted, of necessity, to the void left by absent governance. Families created networks of survival. Communities assumed responsibilities once reserved for the state, maintaining roads, organizing schools, distributing aid. What was once public service became private initiative. Yet the psychological toll was inescapable. The slow disappearance of predictability, of institutional reliability, eroded trust, not only in government, but in the shared social fabric. A nation's citizens, once connected by common expectation, were now left to navigate uncertainty, improvisation, and persistent vulnerability. And still, life endured. Children learned in makeshift classrooms, commerce continued in informal networks, and communities governed themselves, quietly asserting resilience in the absence of authority. The human cost was not always measured in headlines, statistics, or protests. It was measured in patience, in improvisation, in the quiet endurance of millions. And it was measured in what was lost: the confidence that the state would act, the security of predictable governance, and the implicit promise that society structures would protect those within it. Silent collapse does more than dismantle institutions. It reshapes the cultural and psychological landscape of a nation. Authority, once absolute, becomes abstract. Citizenship, once defined by shared responsibility and trust, is reinterpreted as local, ad hoc, and provisional. Generations grow accustomed to improvisation. Public rituals, once grand and inspiring, fade into memory. National identity becomes localized, filtered through experience rather than ideology. The collapse seeps into art, literature, and oral history, leaving a subtle imprint on the collective imagination. In this way, the government does not simply fall, it transforms the consciousness of the people who learn to govern, survive, and endure in silence. And yet, memory of its former authority lingers, a faint echo that shapes both expectation and lament. The culture of silence becomes self-reinforcing. When authority no longer acts, citizens do not demand it, they act themselves. When enforcement fails, morality and cooperation are negotiated locally rather than legislatively. The invisible hand of governance is replaced by the visible presence of human adaptability, ingenuity, and endurance. History teaches in many ways. The silent collapse of this government is both a cautionary tale and a lens through which contemporary governance can be examined. Effective governance relies not only on power, but on legitimacy, transparency, and trust. Institutions, even the most robust, cannot endure without engagement from the citizens they serve. Oversight, accountability, and civic participation are not optional, They are essential. Policymakers, scholars, and leaders around the world can learn from this quiet failure. Neglect small inefficiencies at your peril. Delay decisions, ignore public sentiment, allow transparency to wither, and the collapse may arrive, silently, without dramatic spectacle, yet profoundly irreversible. A government is not merely the sum of its laws or offices. It is the trust between authority and the people, the legitimacy that allows action to be accepted, and the continuity that makes promises credible. Once these are eroded, the collapse is inevitable, no matter the strength of armies or sophistication of bureaucracies. Silent collapses are perhaps the most instructive, one historian notes. They reveal the hidden vulnerabilities of institutions. They remind us that power without trust is a hollow vessel. Another writes, when we study revolutions, wars, and coups, we see spectacle. When we study silent collapses, we see endurance, both human and institutional. It is a lesson in resilience, adaptation, and ultimately, the fragility of authority. In reflecting upon this government, historians are unanimous in one point. The fall was not sudden, nor entirely avoidable, but it was preventable. Subtle interventions, attention to administrative integrity, investment in transparency, and cultivation of civic engagement might have altered the trajectory. Yet history rarely records what might have been. Instead, it records what was, leaving silent witnesses, empty offices, abandoned programs, and the people who endured without governance. In the end, the story of a government that collapsed in silence is a story of paradox. It is a tale of absence and presence, failure and adaptation, despair and resilience. Though institutions failed, life persisted. Though authority vanished, society endured. Though promises went unfulfilled, citizens found ways to govern themselves, quietly asserting control over their own destinies. The legacy of this collapse is not simply in what was lost, it is also in what survived: human ingenuity, community solidarity, and the recognition that governance, at its core, is not just power but a fragile trust that must be nurtured continuously. Silent collapses do not make headlines. They do not inspire dramatic retellings. But they speak in whispers, and in those whispers lie lessons far more enduring than any battle, any revolution, or any decree. History listens, and in the silence, it speaks. This was the story of a government that collapsed quietly, a story of silence, endurance, and the profound consequences of absent authority. And in that silence, the nation learned what no decree or policy could ever teach. The human spirit adapts when governments do not. While the collapse appeared silent to the outside world, within the government, a quiet war was raging. Not one of armies or revolutions, but of ambition, rivalry, and subtle sabotage. Decisions were delayed not by circumstance, but by competing interests. Ministers maneuvered for influence. Bureaucrats acted to protect themselves rather than the state. Each compromise, each concession to personal power, chipped away at institutional integrity. Policies were designed not to serve the people but to advance careers, placate allies, or silence opponents. And while citizens remained largely unaware, the machinery of governance was quietly corroded from the inside. In this shadowed arena, the very act of governance became performative. Meetings occurred, minutes were recorded, and decisions were formally made, but in reality, authority was diffused, diluted, and increasingly irrelevant. The collapse, though imperceptible publicly, was orchestrated privately, in whispers and unspoken agendas. The state did not exist in isolation. Regional politics and global pressures added subtle but significant strains. Trade negotiations stalled, foreign aid arrived inconsistently, and geopolitical shifts left the government increasingly out of step with global realities. In neighboring nations, governments adapted to changing circumstances. Here, inertia prevailed. International partners began to doubt the government's reliability, scaling back support and engagement. Economic isolation, subtle sanctions, and shifting alliances compounded the internal decay, accelerating collapse without a single dramatic event. What history often overlooks is the quiet role of external forces in internal failure. A government may crumble from within, but the world beyond its borders can either hasten or mitigate that decline. In this case, it hastened it, with quiet inevitability. In every silent collapse, there are those who refuse to surrender. Teachers continued to educate in improvised classrooms. Farmers maintained production despite absent subsidies. Local councils emerged where none had existed. These were not the heroes recorded in history books, nor the leaders celebrated on national stages. Yet they became the lifeblood of society, sustaining life, culture, and continuity where formal institutions could not. Their stories, quiet and often invisible, reveal a profound truth. Societies endure not because of governments, but because of people. And in this endurance, even in absence, hope persisted. Physical structures, rituals, and symbols outlast administrations, and in their silence, they tell a story. Empty halls, rusting monuments, and faded portraits become memorials of authority lost. Culture, too, preserves memory. Folklore, oral histories, and community narratives adapt to capture the absence of governance. Festivals are reinterpreted, stories reshaped, and public consciousness retains both the memory of authority and the lessons of its loss. In this way, collapse is never complete. Authority may vanish, but its traces linger, in stone, in story, and in the human imagination. A government's collapse is rarely as it appears in headlines. Violence is absent, revolution is absent, and yet the impact is profound. Silent collapse reshapes societies from the inside, altering trust, authority, and the way people govern themselves. This is a story of absence and presence, of erosion and resilience, of silent failure and enduring human spirit. In examining this collapse, we see the fragility of authority, the importance of accountability, and the resilience of those who endure. Governments may rise and fall, yet society persists. And in the silence left behind, history whispers its lessons. Power must be nurtured with legitimacy, authority sustained by trust, and citizens continually engaged. The story of this government reminds us that silence is not empty, it is instructive. And in that instruction lies the enduring legacy of both failure and human resilience. Beneath the calm surface of administration, a quiet storm of intrigue persisted. Not battles fought with armies, but subtle maneuvers that would define the fate of the state. Loyalties shifted in silence, allegiances were traded in private corridors, and every decision carried the weight of hidden agendas. Power, once exercised openly, became a shadow play. Ministers whispered in corners. Advisors nudged policies to suit ambition. Each subtle act, unobserved by the public, incrementally weakened the authority of the state. Decisions delayed, promises postponed, and compromises hidden, all became instruments of erosion. In this unseen battlefield, the collapse accelerated. Authority became performative, not functional. The government appeared to operate, yet in truth, it existed only in ceremony. Every unspoken act of self-interest, every silent betrayal, deepened the fissures that would eventually split the state apart. In the quiet collapse, the human stories are often overlooked. Citizens became the true stewards of continuity. A teacher, left without a government-provided salary, found ways to teach dozens of children in borrowed spaces. A farmer, denied subsidy payments, organized a cooperative to sustain local agriculture. These micro-stories reveal the resilience of a society left to its own devices. Communities invented systems of order, justice, and education, small triumphs against the absence of authority. In these acts, governance continued without governance, and life endured where institutions failed. The silent collapse extended beyond politics. It reshaped the economy and social life. Factories slowed, supply chains faltered, and public services became inconsistent. Informal markets thrived, not by design, but necessity. The effects were subtle but cumulative. Urban migration increased, local inequalities deepened, and social cohesion was tested. Communities adapted, but at a cost. Opportunities for national coordination, economic planning, and social safety nets vanished quietly, leaving society to patch together survival from fragmented pieces. What was once planned and predictable became improvised and fragile. Citizens adapted, but the economy, like the government, fell into a slow, silent entropy. A government's collapse is more than political, it is philosophical. It forces reflection on the nature of authority, trust, and human adaptation. Power is not merely control, it is the recognition of legitimacy. Authority is not imposed, it is accepted, nurtured, and maintained. When trust erodes, when promises remain unfulfilled, governance loses its soul. Silent collapse is the ultimate lesson in humility. Power is fleeting, structures are fragile, and human resilience is a constant. Through silence, the state spoke truths that loud revolutions often cannot, that authority alone does not sustain society, that legitimacy is fragile, and that a government without the belief of its people is already in decline. The story of a government that collapsed in silence is not a story of chaos, it is a story of quiet endurance. Structures fell, offices emptied, and authority vanished. Yet life adapted, continued, and persisted. The state may have disappeared, but society endured. Communities governed themselves. Families sustained traditions. Citizens reclaimed responsibility, proving that human spirit is not dictated by government alone. In silence, the lessons are loud. Power is temporary, legitimacy is precious, and governance exists not merely in laws or decrees, but in the trust, engagement, and resilience of the people. History listens, even when governments do not. And in the quiet, the story speaks of collapse, yes, but also of survival, adaptation, and enduring human spirit. The collapse of a government leaves traces not only in buildings, but in memory. Generations born under silence inherit a world where authority is abstract, legitimacy uncertain, and governance inconsistent. Young citizens grow up improvising solutions, learning that responsibility is local and self-driven. Traditions once enforced by the state are now maintained by families and communities. These generational adaptations carry both resilience and risk. While communities thrive through ingenuity, the absence of formal structures creates gaps in knowledge, coordination, and civic culture, gaps that may take decades to repay. In this way, the collapse is intergenerational. Its consequences ripple silently through society, shaping expectations, behaviors, and perceptions of authority for decades to come. Amid absence, quiet heroes emerge. They are not celebrated in history books, nor adorned with medals. They are teachers who continue to educate, farmers who feed communities, elders who resolve disputes, and volunteers who keep society running. Their stories are often overlooked, but they are the true custodians of continuity. In the silent collapse, these individuals ensure that life continues, that culture survives, and that society retains coherence. Their endurance proves a paradox. Even as institutions fail, human agency persists, and society adapts. Authority may vanish, but resilience remains. The world watched, often unaware. International organizations, neighboring states, and foreign partners observed the decline, sometimes intervening, often hesitant. Aid was inconsistent, advice ignored, partnerships fractured. What might have been mitigated through strategic support instead became a quiet reinforcement of failure. External actors, unfamiliar with the subtleties of the silent collapse, misread the signals. They saw a functioning state where, in reality, authority had already eroded. History demonstrates that silent collapses are invisible even to observers who are nearby. The absence of spectacle makes misjudgment inevitable, and misjudgment accelerates the trajectory of decline. Silent collapse is as much psychological as it is structural. Authority once accepted becomes doubted. Trust, once granted, erodes quietly. Citizens learn to anticipate failure rather than governance. This adaptation becomes a survival mechanism. Communities function independently, improvising governance where formal authority is absent. Yet this very adaptation reinforces the collapse. When people no longer demand government accountability, institutions have no reason to act. In the end, silence becomes self-reinforcing. Authority is questioned. Citizens adapt. Institutions decay further. And the cycle repeats, imperceptibly, until the state's presence is remembered only as memory. A government that collapses in silence leaves behind paradoxical legacies. Structures vanish. Authority recedes. Yet life continues. Society adapts, and resilience thrives. The lessons are quiet, profound, and enduring. Power is temporary, legitimacy is fragile, and governance is sustained only through trust, accountability, and engagement. Citizens, in their adaptation, demonstrate that human spirit endures even when authority fails. History rarely chronicles these collapses with drama. They pass unnoticed in the daily rhythm of life. Yet their echoes shape generations, redefine culture, and offer warnings to every government that assumes its permanence. In silence, the state speaks its final truths. And in listening, society learns not only what it lost, but also what it can endure, rebuild, and transform. As the central government weakened, local power brokers quietly assumed influence. These figures, often overlooked by historians, became arbiters of daily life. Their authority was neither formal nor sanctioned, yet it was recognized by necessity. Communities adapted to rely on these unofficial leaders. Decisions once taken in ministries were now made under the shade of a tree, in private homes, or at informal assemblies. The absence of central oversight allowed ingenuity to flourish, but also allowed inequity, favoritism, and unseen corruption to take root. In every corner of the nation, power shifted quietly, imperceptibly, demonstrating that governance is not only institutional, it is relational, social, and human. In the vacuum left by absent governance, ordinary citizens became innovators. Markets reorganized spontaneously, local industries developed informal networks, and communities created systems of credit, trade, and regulation independent of the state. What appears to be chaos is, in reality, adaptive intelligence. Where bureaucracy failed, social ingenuity thrived. Citizens engineered solutions that governments had long promised but failed to deliver. Yet innovation alone could not replace institutional authority. While communities survived and even flourished locally, systemic coordination, roads, healthcare, justice, remained fragile, leaving society resilient, but uneven. Culture preserves memory where institutions fail. In the absence of government, art, folklore, and ritual became vessels for collective experience. Murals on walls, stories shared by elders, and festivals adapted to reflect the new social order. They recorded not decrees, but endurance. The collapse became embedded in cultural memory. Authority vanished, but the lessons it imparted, through absence, improvisation, and resilience, remained. And in these artistic expressions, the silent failures of governance spoke more loudly than any official document ever could. The silent collapse of a government is not unique. History records similar phenomena across the world: post-imperial administrations, bureaucracies undermined by corruption, and states hollowed by absent legitimacy. By comparing these events, one observes a recurring pattern: gradual erosion of authority, displacement of responsibility to communities, adaptation by citizens, and eventual redefinition of governance. What distinguishes a silent collapse from other failures is its subtlety. There is no battle, no coup, no dramatic overthrow, only a slow, almost imperceptible reallocation of authority and the quiet education of a society in self-reliance. In the aftermath of a silent collapse, legacy is both absence and presence. Institutions fall, yet culture endures. Authority disappears, yet human agency persists. Communities, having learned to adapt, reclaim responsibility, and shape the future. The lessons are profound. Legitimacy must be earned, authority must be maintained, and citizens' engagement is essential. Where these principles fail, silent collapse becomes inevitable. And yet, the enduring truth is this: life continues, society adapts, and the human spirit, resilient and inventive, carries forward even when governments do not. History often celebrates presidents, prime ministers, and cabinet leaders. Yet, in a silent collapse, the decisions, or indecisions, of mid-level officials shape outcomes as profoundly as the decrees of those at the top. These forgotten bureaucrats processed memos slowly, deferred approvals, and allowed programs to stagnate. Each postponed decision added weight to the growing vacuum of authority. The collapse was not solely the failure of leaders, but of a system in which every cog mattered. Silence in governance is cumulative. When every minor decision is deferred, ignored, or manipulated, the machinery of the state grinds down quietly until its absence is felt by millions. The silent collapse reshaped the moral and psychological landscape. Trust, once assumed, became a conscious choice. Individuals learned to rely on local networks rather than national institutions. Ethics and responsibility shifted from law to community. Survival required moral negotiation. Fairness, reciprocity, and consensus replaced formal regulation. Citizens bore the weight of governance, navigating dilemmas without formal guidance. This psychological adaptation, while necessary, carried consequences. Expectation of authority diminished. Faith in institutional fairness eroded. Yet in this vacuum, humanity found new ways to define itself, morally and socially. Memory persists where authority fails. Culture became the vessel through which the silent collapse was remembered. Stories, murals, and oral traditions preserved the lessons, failures, and adaptations of a society abandoned by its government. These cultural artifacts transformed absence into instruction. Children grew up learning through stories, not decrees. Communities enacted rituals to maintain order, not through law, but through tradition. The silent collapse left behind legends of endurance, quietly shaping the nation's identity long after formal authority disappeared. In the end, the story of a government that collapsed in silence is a story of paradox. Structures vanished, authority receded, yet life persisted. Communities adapted, culture endured, and human spirit demonstrated its resilience. Silent collapse is subtle, yet instructive. It teaches that legitimacy must be nurtured, authority sustained, and citizens continually engaged. It reminds us that governance is not merely rules or decrees. It is trust, participation, and social cohesion. History rarely records these collapses with spectacle, yet in their quiet, enduring lessons lie the blueprint of both failure and resilience. In absence, society thrives. In silence, the human spirit speaks. Even in silence, resistance persisted. Communities did not merely adapt, they asserted agency. From informal courts to grassroots patrols, citizens filled gaps left by absent authority. These small acts of resistance were not violent revolutions. They were quiet declarations of self-determination. Survival became a form of governance, improvisation a substitute for law, and collective action a reflection of enduring civic consciousness. In the vacuum left by formal institutions, microeconomies flourished. Communities engineered trade networks, barter systems, and self-sufficient marketplaces. Cultural rituals adapted to sustain social order, blending governance, tradition, and economic necessity. Here, culture and commerce became intertwined. Markets were not merely for goods. They were spaces of negotiation, cooperation, and decision-making. In these microcosms, governance was lived, not legislated, revealing the enduring adaptability of human society. The collapse of a government challenges our understanding of power. Authority is not permanent, legitimacy is fragile. Civic structures rely not only on decree, but on trust, engagement, and shared responsibility. Silent collapse offers a stark lesson. Governance is only as strong as the societal contract that underpins it. When that trust erodes, even the most imposing institutions fail quietly, leaving citizens to navigate responsibility, morality, and continuity on their own. As this story unfolds, we approach the final reflection, a nation that endured its silent collapse. Life persisted, culture endured, and human agency thrived. Communities governed themselves, improvised solutions, and preserved memory. The legacy of silence is paradoxical. Absence brought hardship, but also innovation. Failure revealed resilience. Neglect demanded human creativity. In this balance between loss and adaptation, the nation learned lessons that no decree or law could ever teach. And as we move to the conclusion, the echoes of silence remind us that governance is not only about structures, it is about trust, legitimacy, and the enduring spirit of the people. In the quiet collapse, women and marginalized groups became indispensable actors. Where formal authority faltered, they assumed responsibility for education, trade, healthcare, and community governance. These contributions were rarely recognized in official accounts. Yet without their labor, networks, and organization, survival would have been far more precarious. In silence, they became the backbone of society, teachers, healers, mediators, and innovators. History often overlooks those who operate in absence of authority. In this collapse, their agency was both essential and transformative, revealing that survival and adaptation are collective, not hierarchical. The collapse left more than social and political traces. It reshaped the physical landscape. Roads fell into disrepair, bridges weakened, and public buildings decayed. Nature reclaimed spaces once maintained by governance. Yet in some cases, communities adapted ingeniously. Local repair crews, cooperative farming initiatives, and informal water management systems mitigated the worst consequences. The environment, once managed centrally, became both a challenge and an opportunity for human ingenuity. In the interplay of neglect and adaptation, the collapse left a tangible imprint on the nation's geography, demonstrating that governance is inseparable from the landscapes it shapes. The silent collapse was not isolated. Around the world, states have experienced similar fates: gradual erosion of authority, diminished trust, and societal adaptation. Each instance offers lessons. Governance depends not solely on power, but on legitimacy, transparency, and engagement. International actors often misinterpret silent collapse. Without spectacle, the erosion of authority goes unnoticed until its consequences are unavoidable. The lesson is clear. Governments must continually nurture trust, invest in accountability, and remain connected to the needs of their citizens. History teaches that silence can be as instructive as conflict, and that invisible decline may leave consequences more enduring than any revolution or war. A silent collapse challenges our understanding of authority and power. Governance is not simply laws or decrees. It is trust, legitimacy, and social cohesion. When these erode, even the most robust institutions falter. Yet the human spirit adapts. Communities innovate. Citizens self-govern. Life persists. Silent collapse teaches a paradoxical truth. Even in absence, society endures, adapts, and survives. Authority may vanish, but resilience persists. The collapse is both warning and lesson. Power without legitimacy is ephemeral. Governance without trust is fragile, and the endurance of society relies on the engagement and ingenuity of its people. The story of a government that collapsed in silence is a story of paradox. Authority disappeared, structures decayed, yet life endured. Communities adapted, culture persisted, human spirit triumphed. Silent collapse teaches that governance is more than power, It is trust, legitimacy, and civic engagement. Citizens, in adapting to absence, redefined governance. History records a collapse, but it is society's resilience that endures. In silence, lessons are whispered, echoes of the past resonate, and the human spirit speaks. Life continues, communities thrive, and the legacy of both failure and endurance is passed to generations yet to come. Beyond the ministers and leaders recorded in history, countless mid-level bureaucrats shaped the collapse. They were the silent actors whose indecisions, delays, and compromises compounded the fragility of governance. Every deferred approval, unprocessed memo, and postponed initiative slowly hollowed the machinery of the state. Though invisible to the public, their actions, or inaction, were as consequential as the policies they nominally served to implement. Silent collapse, therefore, is cumulative. Small acts of neglect ripple outward until the entire system loses cohesion, leaving society to adapt in the vacuum of authority. In the absence of formal authority, religious institutions and moral leaders assumed new weight. They became arbiters of ethics, mediators in conflict, and guides for communities navigating uncertainty. Rituals were not mere tradition, they were instruments of social cohesion, maintaining trust and continuity when bureaucracies failed. Religious and moral authority became both a substitute and complement to absent governance, offering stability through shared values and practice. Citizens created networks invisible to the central government. Trade, health, and education operated independently, connected by trust rather than law. These networks were fragile but ingenious. Communities leveraged personal relationships, shared knowledge, and collective action to maintain continuity. In a silent collapse, survival depends on these hidden systems, the threads that stitch society together when formal authority unravels. The effects of silent collapse ripple across generations. Children born under absent authority learn self-governance, improvisation, and communal responsibility. Elders preserve memory, transmitting both warnings and wisdom. Generations adapt in ways the central government never anticipated, creating societies resilient, yet fundamentally reshaped. Trust, ethics, and responsibility are inherited as lessons of survival. Authority may vanish, but culture and collective knowledge endure. As this story moves toward its conclusion, the legacy of silence becomes clear. Absence of government does not mean absence of life. Communities adapt. Culture persists. Human ingenuity prevails. The lessons are subtle yet profound. Governance is sustained not solely by authority, but by trust, engagement, and shared responsibility. Silent collapse teaches that resilience is human, not institutional, and that society's endurance depends on its people as much as its structures. What follows is the final reflection, a narrative that ties together history, philosophy, culture, and human spirit in a poetic, cinematic finale. The silent collapse was shaped as much by the unnoticed decisions of minor political figures as by the grand policies of ministers. These individuals, bureaucrats, local council leaders, mid-level administrators, exercised discretion, postponed action, or quietly resisted initiatives. Their choices often went unseen, yet cumulatively, they determined the trajectory of the state. Policies stalled. Infrastructure degraded. Programs designed to support citizens were left incomplete. History rarely credits those who fail silently, but in their absence, society learned to survive without authority. The collapse left tangible traces on the landscape. Infrastructure decayed, public buildings fell into disrepair, nature encroached on urban spaces. Yet communities adapted. Local repair initiatives, cooperative farming, and improvised energy solutions mitigated the consequences of absent governance. The environment became both a challenge and a teacher, revealing that human ingenuity is essential when authority fails. Survival was as much about adaptation to physical decay as to political absence. Culture became the vessel for memory and resilience. In absence of government, art, performance, and storytelling preserved the lessons of collapse. Murals depicted self-governance, plays dramatized adaptation, oral histories recorded survival strategies. Through these mediums, communities maintained continuity, transmitted knowledge across generations, and immortalized the silent collapse. Culture, in this context, was both archive and instruction, a living testament to resilience. The phenomenon of silent collapse is not unique. Around the globe, bureaucracies have eroded quietly, institutions have decayed, and societies have adapted independently. Each case illustrates a universal principle. Governance is sustained only by legitimacy, trust, and engagement. Observers abroad often misread silent decline. Without dramatic upheaval, the erosion of authority can go unnoticed until consequences are unavoidable. History teaches that slow decay may leave deeper, longer-lasting impacts than revolutions or wars. As this narrative approaches its conclusion, the legacy of silent collapse emerges. Authority vanished, yet life continued. Communities adapted, culture endured, and human ingenuity triumphed. The lessons are subtle but enduring. Governance requires trust, legitimacy, and citizen engagement. Silent collapse demonstrates that resilience is human, not institutional, and that society thrives not merely because of structures, but because of the people who inhabit them. In these final chapters, the echoes of silence prepare us for reflection, a poetic and cinematic closure that ties together history, human spirit, and the enduring lessons of absence.